Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. Venezuela was never colonised by the British. The first known European contact was in 1498, when the Spanish encountered the indigenous population of Caribs, Arawak and Mitotaquicas. The Spaniards would have witnessed vast trade networks, farming systems and political structures, but unlike the Aztecs in what is now modern central Mexico and the Incas, now Colombia and Peru, these peoples had no centralised empire. Spanish colonisation was slow and fragmented, with settlements along the coast and inland valleys, and the name Venezuela, or Little Venice, could have come from Amerigo Vespucci's description of stilt houses along Lake Maracaibo. For a brief period, 1528 to 46, control of Venezuela was granted to the Wexler banking family, but the Spanish crown took back control after the Germans' failure to discover gold. As one form of forced labour, enslaved Africans gradually replaced another, the encomienda of the indigenous people. Pearls and cocoa became central to this colonial economy and were the main exports, especially to Europe. Despite the creation of the Captaincy General of Venezuela in 1777 to unify the provinces, resistance continued throughout the colonial period as enslaved Africans formed maroon communities, and Juan de Leon's rebellion was met with another revolution coming from across the Atlantic: the Enlightenment. Caracas junta declared independence from Spain in 1810, and Venezuela followed in 1821 after a decade of war. Like all former territories, Venezuela's problems and challenges have descended from its colonial history, as social inequalities, policies promoting unequal land distribution, powerful social elites, weak institutions, and a predominantly mixed-race society with deeply rooted but subtle racial hierarchies. With the world's largest oil reserve, vast amounts of natural gas, gold, cobalt and other minerals, Venezuela is also strategically located with direct access to the Caribbean and Atlantic trade routes, the Panama Canal and the US mainland. Major global powers, especially the US, see Venezuela as a potential energy supplier and a key bargaining chip in global energy security. Their alliances with US rivals such as Russia, China and Iran makes Venezuela a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere and courts increasing competition close to US borders. Its ideology of nationalism, alliances, location and natural reserves has not only caused some of the largest mass migration flows across the world, but has also granted Venezuela a diplomatic flexibility and leverage. So when there's a shift in global politics, it can lead to diplomatic openings with other Western powers. So what has been the most recent global shifts? Trump's sympathy toward Russia and North Korea and his urge to European powers to increase their defence budgets. The NATO alliance seems to be in jeopardy. The US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, showing an anti-sustainability stance and an interest in increased oil consumption. US economic and military rivalry with China's influence and investment in Latin America, and the global trade war as a result. The tragedy of October the 7th and the consequences that have ensued because of it. The potential of a regime overthrow and a revolution in Iran, and not to mention the ongoing conflicts in Sudan and Yemen. With threats to intervene in Colombia and Cuba and a possible invasion of Greenland, does the US president have aspirations of imperialism? His claims are based on what was announced by US President James Monroe in his annual message to US Congress on December 2nd, 1823. Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere is no longer open to European colonisation, and any attempt to interfere in the Americas would be viewed as a threat to US security. In return, the US would not interfere in European affairs and express neutrality in European conflicts. Trump's rebranding of Monroe's declaration is similar in its assertion of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, but differs in justifying military strategic action to counter and eliminate strategic perceived threats. However, Trump's language triggered historical sensitivities across much of Latin America, and many governments and regional organisations argued that invoking the Monroe Doctrine undermines national sovereignty, revives memories of US interventions in the 20th century, and treats Latin America as a US sphere of influence, where leaders and diplomats frequently describe it as colonial, outdated, and contrary to international law. This rebranded doctrine was put to the test on the 3rd of January 2026 when Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was captured by United States forces during a large-scale military operation in Caracas. The mission, described by US officials as a law enforcement and military action, involved strikes on targets in the Venezuelan capital and culminated in Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, being taken into US custody. After his capture that night, Maduro was flown to New York City, where he was brought before a federal court on serious charges, including drug trafficking and weapons offences. In court, he pleaded not guilty, claimed he had been kidnapped, and insisted he remained Venezuela's legitimate president. In response to his removal, Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice declared Maduro's position vacant and ordered Vice President Delcy Rodriguez to assume the presidency in an interim capacity to maintain government continuity. According to international reports, the country has seen both unrest and repression since these events. In the past, the US played a pivotal role in both world wars by supporting the Allies in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. By creating NATO and delivering the Marshall Plan, saw the US become a superpower, and the Monroe Doctrine became a more covert vehicle for a new kind of colonialism in a more far-reaching attempt to influence regime change, not in the sphere of influence, but across the world. The last 8 decades have seen US involvement in conflicts from North Korea to Vietnam, from Afghanistan to Libya, from Cold War Latin America to Iraq, and from Syria to Ukraine in the present. These interventions have provided a mixed bag of outcomes, which range from being highly successful and reshaping the global order, to strategic stalemate with no deciding victory, to major failure, high casualties and loss of credibility. And the results have also led to unresolved issues leading to regional instability and future conflict, and limited success with no potential solution. The current war against Ukraine may have actually strengthened the NATO alliance, despite the ongoing conflict. When US intervention works best, it has clear objectives, broad international consensus, and support with short, decisive military goals, but it fails in attempts to nation build regime change without post-war planning, and prolongs and overstays its occupation in places such as Vietnam, Iraq, and more recently, Afghanistan. However, for the purposes of this podcast series, we must consider how Britain's interests in its Caribbean former colonies, now mostly independent Commonwealth states, are indirectly but significantly affected by Trump's Don-roe interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. The impact is less about direct confrontation and more about sovereignty, diplomacy, security, and great power competition in a region where the UK still has influence through the Commonwealth and protection of British overseas territories such as the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, Bermuda, Anguilla, and the British Virgin Islands. As Trump's Don-roe framing treats the Caribbean as part of a US sphere of influence, this undermines the principle that Caribbean states are fully sovereign actors, making UK diplomacy more sensitive, as Britain must avoid appearing to support US dominance. And also, Caribbean governments may fear being pressured into US positions rather than UK or Commonwealth aligned ones. The US already dominates the Caribbean economically and militarily, and the Don-roe Doctrine could reinforce unilateral US leadership and may expect a greater say in regional security decisions. And any crisis, such as migration, Venezuela spillover, or drugs, could justify US unilateral action. This could potentially marginalise multilateral forums such as the UN and the Commonwealth, and as a result the UK influence risks being crowded out by US pressure, so Britain must balance its close US alliance with respect for Caribbean autonomy. So what could be the impact of the Don-roe Doctrine? Well, many Caribbean leaders reject revived Monroe-style doctrines and fear being forced to choose between the US, China and traditional partners as they value Britain's more low-key, legalistic and multilateral approach. Caribbean governments may see Britain as aligned with US pressure rather than their development priorities, weakening Commonwealth ties, and Britain risks being associated with US interventionism if it's not careful. Britain's soft power role will become harder to sustain if the region is framed as a US backyard, raising questions about autonomy and command in states of emergencies. And finally, it would affect Britain's role as a neutral partner and defender of international law. Is there the potential for Britain to position itself as a moderating multilateral counterweight and reinforce Commonwealth diplomacy and international law and find a way to strengthen soft power by respecting Caribbean autonomy? It seems that out of the Don-roe Doctrine, Britain could carve out a new sphere of influence, one that could bring a wealth of opportunities, but also can present many risks. If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform, click the subscribe button and check out my other episodes related to this one, such as Colonialism, Just a Thing of the Past, Parts 1 and 2 from the second season, In Search of a Peace That Is Noble, and The American Dream, Autocracy or Democracy, both from the 5th season. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change, These are all available on the website in paperback, on Amazon in Kindle format and in ebook format at Apple Books and all other digital platforms. Also, the publication of the latest 4 titles. Now, if you want to find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. If you'd like to sign up to my email list, just visit the website where you can opt in and receive your free samples of my first 4 titles. And finally, remember that you can also send me an audio message on the SpeakPipe link, which is also in the show notes, so don't be a stranger. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click onto whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. And as always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next page.